I said it as a joke. I want you to understand that first. It was the kind of throwaway line a person says when they're trying to be funny and a little charming and mostly just filling silence. My sister had just left the room to take a call from her boyfriend. The rain had started hammering the windows without any warning, and I was standing in the kitchen of an apartment that wasn't mine, holding an empty coffee mug, looking at a woman I hadn't seen in 3 years. "Can I stay tonight?" I said with a grin, gesturing at the rain with the mug like it was obvious. She turned from the counter. Her eyes met mine, and then something I didn't expect happened. She blushed, not a polite social flush, a real one, the kind that starts at the throat and works its way up slowly like it has something important to say and isn't in a hurry. She looked away before she answered. "If you want," she said quietly. And I stood there with the joke already dead in my mouth because something in those 3 words felt like a door I hadn't known existed had just swung open. My name is Marcus. I'm 34 now. At the time this story begins, I was 31, recently divorced in all the ways that matter except legally, and working as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm downtown that designed bridges and overpasses and occasionally the kind of buildings that make people stop on sidewalks and look up. I was good at my job. People trusted me with load calculations and material stress and the invisible mathematics of things that hold other things together. The irony was not lost on me later that I was professionally excellent at understanding what keeps structures from collapsing. And personally, I had watched my own life fall apart with almost no ability to stop it. Her name was Diane. She was 29 at the time, a landscape architect who worked freelance, mostly designing private gardens and the occasional public green space for city contracts. She was quiet in the way that some people are quiet not because they have nothing to say, but because they've learned to be selective about who receives their words. She had known my sister Priya since university. They had been in the same program for 2 years before Priya switched to communications, but the friendship had outlasted the shared classes by almost a decade. I had met Diane maybe 4 or 5 times over those years. Birthday dinners, a holiday gathering, once at a small farewell party Priya threw before moving to her current apartment. I had noticed her each time the way you notice a particular piece of music in a crowded restaurant, not loudly, not in a way you could explain to anyone, just present. Just there in a way that makes the air around it feel slightly different. I had told myself it meant nothing. Anyone watching from the outside would have known better. Priya's apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in a quiet part of the city. It had 1 bedroom, a study that she'd turned into a second sleeping space with a fold-out sofa, and a kitchen window that faced a courtyard with a large maple tree. Diane had been staying there for 2 weeks when I arrived that evening. I hadn't known she would be there. Priya had mentioned she was having a friend over for the week and asked if I wanted to come for dinner. I said yes because my own apartment at that point felt like a very accurate physical representation of my interior life, functional, organized, and completely without warmth. Diane and I had said hello with the careful politeness of people who know each other just enough that it would be weird to treat each other like strangers, and not well enough to hug without overthinking it. We shook hands. She smiled. I noticed she was wearing paint-stained jeans and a gray sweater, and her hair was pulled back unevenly, like she'd done it while thinking about something else. I noticed all of it and then looked away. There was something on the kitchen counter when I arrived that I noticed and almost didn't think about again. A small glass terrarium, no bigger than a shoebox, sitting near the window with the maple tree view. Inside it were several small succulents and mosses arranged with obvious care, and at the center, a tiny ceramic figure of a person sitting with their knees drawn up to their chest. It looked handmade. The figure was rough in a way that suggested it had been made by someone learning, not someone who'd given up on precision but someone still finding it. I almost asked about it. Then Priya called us to the table and I forgot. I would understand it weeks later and feel like a fool for forgetting. Dinner was easy. Priya was always good at filling a room with energy, talking about 3 things at once, switching between stories, laughing at her own jokes before she finished them. Diane was quieter. She asked me about bridge engineering once and actually listened to my answer instead of waiting politely for me to stop talking. She said she thought about structural integrity a lot in her work too, just applied to soil and root systems and the way plants anchor themselves in different ground conditions. I said that was surprisingly similar to what I did, and she said maybe that's why Priya liked us both. Then Priya's phone rang and she stepped out and the rain started and I made my joke. That night I slept on the fold-out sofa in the study. The door to the main room where Diane was sleeping was closed. I lay in the dark listening to rain on glass and tried to analyze what had happened with the same logical precision I applied to stress calculations. A woman blushed. She said, "If you want." That was it. I had no architecture for what that meant, no reliable data. I told myself I was reading into things because I was lonely and recently wounded, and the human brain in those conditions looks for warmth in small embers and sometimes mistakes them for fires. I almost believed myself. In the morning, Diane was already in the kitchen when I got up. She had made coffee, the real kind, in a French press, not the pod machine Priya used, and she was standing at the window looking at the maple tree in the courtyard below. The leaves were early October, just starting to turn. She had a mug with both hands around it and she was very still. She didn't hear me come in. I watched her for a moment, not the way men watch women in films where it's possessive or loaded, just the way you watch something that seems at peace and you don't want to disturb it. I must have made a sound because she turned. She wasn't startled. She just looked at me and then at the second mug she'd placed on the counter. "I made enough," she said. "You didn't know I was awake?" "No," she said. "But I made enough anyway." I thought I was being kind when I said thank you and poured myself a cup and stood beside her at the window without talking much. That was all. Over the next 3 days, because the rain kept coming in unpredictable bursts and my own projects were in a waiting phase for permits and approvals, I stayed. Not every night, but most of them. Priya seemed delighted. She called it her apartment's 2-person residency program and made a small ceremony of giving me a spare key. Diane said nothing about any of it. She went about her own routines with a kind of self-contained grace that I found myself orbiting without fully realizing it. She worked from the kitchen table in the mornings, her laptop open, site maps and plant references spread around her like a garden of paper. She had a specific way of pressing her thumb against her lower lip when she was thinking. She made very strong tea in the afternoons and always offered me some, even though she knew by the 3rd day that I always said yes. She went for walks alone in the evenings and came back with small things she'd collected. A particular leaf, a smooth stone, once a small piece of bark with an interesting texture. She placed them near the terrarium by the window in a loose arrangement that was somehow orderly in its carelessness. I asked her once what the ceramic figure inside the terrarium was. She picked it up carefully through the side opening of the glass, held it out to me. "I made it," she said, "about a year ago. In a class I took because I was going through something and my therapist said to try something with my hands." "What were you going through?" She looked at the figure for a moment. "A version of what everyone goes through eventually." She put it back. I kept it because I thought it looked a little like someone who was deciding whether to stand up. I held that sentence quietly for a long time. On the 4th evening, Priya had plans she couldn't cancel, something with her boyfriend's family that she'd forgotten to mention. She left with the specific kind of apology that isn't really an apology because she didn't think she'd done anything wrong. And the door clicked behind her, and Diane and I were alone in the apartment together for the first time. We made dinner together without planning to. She was already starting something on the stove when I asked if she needed help, and she handed me vegetables to cut without ceremony, like we'd divided kitchen labor 100 times before. We talked while we cooked, small things first, her most difficult client, a garden she was designing for a family who kept changing their minds about whether they wanted a fountain. I told her about the first bridge I'd ever worked on, a pedestrian footbridge across a small urban river. And how I'd gone back 3 months after it opened and stood on it and felt it move the exact calculated amount in the exact calculated way under the exact calculated load, and felt something I could only describe as proof. Proof of what? She asked. That you can plan for something holding, and sometimes it does. She looked at me over the steam from the pot. Something moved in her expression. She didn't say anything for a moment, then she said, I haven't felt that in a while. That's something I planned for is holding. I didn't ask what she meant, not then, but I didn't forget it either. After dinner, we sat on the small couch and she had her legs folded under her and there was about 2 feet of space between us, and we watched nothing in particular on the television and the silence. Between us was the comfortable kind, which was unusual because comfortable silences take time and we hadn't had much of it. I was hyper-aware of the distance, not because I wanted to close it, because it felt like it meant something that I hadn't closed it and she hadn't either, and we were both apparently fine with that. When Priya came home, she looked at us and looked at the dirty dishes and looked at the comfortable arrangement of the couch, and something in her face went very carefully neutral. You cooked, she said. She cooked, I said. I cut things. Priya looked at Diane. Diane looked at the television. Priya said nothing else and went to make herself tea. But I caught the edge of a smile she was working to suppress, and something in my chest tightened the way it does when you realize that someone sees the thing you've been trying not to see yourself. The small clues had been there, I understand that now. The extra coffee mug before she knew I was awake, the way she remembered I took it black after one observation. The fact that she'd clearly told Priya she was staying another week past the original plan. The terrarium moved from the kitchen counter to the study windowsill just slightly closer to where I slept. I hadn't moved it. I assumed she had some reason. I did not ask. I told myself I was imagining patterns. I was an engineer. Engineers see structures everywhere, even in chaos. I was applying professional bias, that was all. The call came on a Thursday evening. I was in the study reading something I can't remember now, and I heard Diane's voice through the half-open door change register in the way voices do when they shift from casual to careful, not loud. She wasn't arguing, but the silence between her sentences was the wrong kind of silence. The kind where someone on the other end is saying something difficult and the person listening is deciding whether to fight it or absorb it. I stood up without meaning to, then sat back down. Then stood again because I am apparently incapable of pretending I don't care about things that I clearly care about. A few minutes later, she appeared in the study doorway. She'd put her phone in her pocket and she was holding her own elbows in that particular way people do when they want to hold themselves together without appearing to. Sorry, she said. Did I disturb you? No, I said. Are you okay? She leaned against the doorframe, looked at the terrarium on the windowsill. My ex, she said simply. He wants to talk in person. She paused. He always says that like it's a neutral statement, like it doesn't mean anything specific. Like talking in person and talking over the phone are just two options with equal weight. What does it mean? I asked. She looked at me. He wants to try again, she said. He's been saying it in different ways for 4 months. What happened between you two? She crossed her arms a little tighter and then released them deliberately. Like she caught herself doing it and decided to stop. We were engaged, she said, for about a year, and then I found something, not what you usually find, not a person, a letter he'd written to himself, a kind of journal entry. About how he wasn't sure he was in love with me so much as he was sure he was supposed to be. That I was the right kind of person for the life he imagined, and he thought that was probably enough. The room was very quiet. He never sent it, she said. He didn't even know I'd read it. But once you read something like that, you can't put it back, you can't choose not to know. Did you tell him what you'd found? She shook her head. I told him the engagement wasn't right. I told him I felt it. He was devastated. He kept saying I was wrong, that he loved me, that I was making a mistake, and maybe he genuinely believed that. But I had read his own words in his own handwriting, and I knew what I knew. She looked at the little ceramic figure in the terrarium, the small person with knees drawn up, deciding whether to stand. He didn't do anything wrong exactly, she said. He was just honest with himself in private, in a way that meant he hadn't been fully honest with me. And I think he spent 4 months convincing himself that his private honesty was just fear, not truth, and maybe it was, I don't know anymore. Why are you here? I asked. At Priya's, I mean. Not at your own apartment. She looked at me then in a way I hadn't been looked at in a very long time, directly, without performance. Because my apartment is full of him, she said. Not his things, he took those. But it's full of the version of me that read that letter and broke something that couldn't be unbroken, and I needed to be somewhere that wasn't full of that version. I understood that completely. I understood it in my spine. I told her then, not everything but the shape of it, my own marriage. The way it had ended, not dramatically but exhaustedly, like a fire that runs out of available fuel and simply stops. My ex-wife, whose name was Caroline, had not been unfaithful or cruel. She had simply grown into a different person than the one she'd been when we married, and in doing so had outgrown a version of me I was still inhabiting. We had spent the last year of our marriage being polite in ways that were more painful than any argument, because at least arguments would have proved we still felt something sharp enough to cut. The divorce had been filed but not finalized. We were in the procedural middle of it, where everything is paper and waiting and the actual grief has nowhere particular to be. I think we're in similar places, Diane said. I think so, I said. That's not a good reason to start something, she said carefully. No, I said, it isn't, she nodded. And then she said good night and went to the main room and closed the door. And I sat with the terrarium on the windowsill beside me and the ceramic figure inside it, and the question of whether the small person was about to stand up. The next morning she was gone before I woke up. There was coffee. There was a note that just said, "Went to meet with a client, back by 4." It was signed with the initial D, and something in that small domestic informality of a note left on a counter hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. Priya found me standing at the kitchen window with the note still in my hand. "Marcus," she said. "Don't," I said. "I haven't said anything. You're about to say something." She sat down at the table. "She's been my best friend for 10 years, she said. "I know her in ways you don't. And I'm saying this because I love you both. She is not in a simple place, and you are not in a simple place. And simple people in complicated places sometimes make decisions that feel like clarity and turn out to be just another form of running." "I know," I said. "But," Priya said. "There's a but. There's always a but." She folded her hands on the table. "She talked about you before you came, not about you specifically, but about someone who understood weight. Who understood what it means for things to hold." I didn't know what she meant then. I think I understand it now. I put the note down. "Don't do anything stupid," Priya said. "But also don't do nothing." That was the most useful advice anyone gave me that year. Diane came back at 4:15. She was wind-tangled and carrying her portfolio case and looked like someone who had spent the day making decisions about living systems and was still processing the satisfying tiredness of that. She put her case down and saw me at the kitchen table with 2 mugs already prepared and sat down across from me without a word and wrapped her hands around hers, and we looked at each other. "I told him no," she said. "I met him for coffee this morning before the client. I told him no, because of what you read, because of what I read. And because I realized this morning that the reason I'd been going back and forth for 4 months wasn't because I thought he'd changed. It was because I was afraid that if I fully said no, I was saying something bigger, that the life I had planned was gone. That I had to start over from something much earlier in the blueprint. And now I think starting over from earlier in the blueprint is actually more interesting than finishing someone else's plan for a structure that was never going to hold my weight correctly." I smiled. She looked at the smile with some attention, like she was examining whether it was genuine. Apparently it passed. "I also think," she said more carefully, "that I need to go back to my own apartment. I've been here almost 3 weeks. I can't keep using Priya's couch as an excuse to avoid my own life." Something in my chest pulled tight. "That makes sense," I said. "It doesn't mean I want to stop." She stopped, pressed her thumb against her lower lip, the thinking gesture, tried again. "It doesn't mean this has to stop, whatever this is. I just need to be doing it from solid ground, not borrowed ground." "Then get your solid ground," I said. "I'll be here." She looked at me. "Here meaning the city," she clarified. "Here meaning wherever you can find me," I said. She looked away at the maple tree in the courtyard. The leaves were almost fully turned now, orange and deep red, catching whatever afternoon light the clouds permitted. She left the next morning. She packed her things with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. Priya cried a small amount and then denied it. Diane carried the terrarium carefully under one arm, wrapped in a dish towel. At the door, she stopped and looked at me. "The figure in the terrarium," she said. "I made it during the worst week after the engagement ended. I made about 12 of them, gave most of them away. Kept that one because I felt like she needed more time to decide whether to stand up," I said. She nodded, then she left. The 2 weeks after that were an exercise in restraint that I think made me a better engineer, actually, because restraint and precision are close cousins. I did not text her every day, though I wanted to. I texted her every 3 days, short things, a bridge I'd walked past that had interesting railings, a plant I saw in a shop window that I thought she'd have opinions about. She responded in kind, longer sometimes. A garden she was working on, the difficult client with the fountain having finally made up their mind, a piece of bark she'd found. Then she sent me a photo of the terrarium on her own windowsill. Her apartment in natural light, the little ceramic figure visible inside. Below the photo she wrote, "She stood up." I stared at that text for longer than I will admit. Then I wrote back, "Should I come over?" She wrote back, "If you want." And this time it wasn't a joke and there was no blush because we were not in the same room, but I think she was smiling when she wrote it, and I know I was smiling when I read it. I brought nothing special. I brought myself and a plant from the shop I'd mentioned, a small trailing thing with dark green leaves. And she opened the door and looked at the plant and then at me, and the look on her face was the most unguarded thing I had ever seen from her, and I understood in that moment that we had both been building toward this from something earlier and quieter than either of us had admitted. She set the plant on the windowsill beside the terrarium. They looked like they belonged together, which I acknowledged was a ridiculous thought and which I also knew was exactly right. We didn't rush anything after that. It would be wrong to tell this story and make it seem like the arrival was the resolution. It wasn't. There were months of careful, slow, honest construction between that evening and anything that could be called a firm foundation. My divorce finalized in January. Diane had a hard week in November when her ex contacted her one more time, a longer message this time, more considered. And she read it and felt the old pull of the easier path and called me and told me all of it instead of pretending it hadn't happened. I sat on the phone with her and didn't offer solutions because some things don't need solutions, they need witness. She told me later that that phone call was the one where she stopped being uncertain. I told her about Caroline the way I hadn't told anyone, the real version, the one where I took my share of the failure honestly and without performing either guilt or defensiveness. She listened the way she did everything, with full presence and no performance. She asked 2 questions, both of them were the exact right ones. By the following spring, we were not newly together in the fragile sense. We were something that had been built carefully and tested gradually and was showing the kind of holding strength that makes an engineer feel something close to reverence. Priya, for the record, claimed full credit. She said she had engineered the entire thing from the moment she invited me to dinner that October. When I pointed out that she hadn't known Diane would still be there, she said that was what made it elegant. We were at her apartment for dinner, the 3 of us, almost a year after that first evening, and she refilled everyone's glass and said, "I invited you to dinner knowing Diane was here, and I left to take a call knowing you were both in the kitchen, and if you think that phone call from Daniel was not perfectly timed, then you are not as smart as your job title suggests." Diane looked at her. "You planned it," she said. "I observed," Priya said, "and then I created conditions." "Priya, you're welcome," Priya said and raised her glass. I looked at Diane across the table. She was shaking her head at her best friend with the particular helpless affection you reserve for people who have known you long enough to be impossible. And then she looked at me. And whatever I saw in that look, I am not going to try to put into words, because some structural calculations are precise enough to be beautiful, and some are just beautiful, and the distinction stops mattering. There is a thing I have thought about many times since then, the moment of the joke. Standing in a kitchen I didn't belong in, holding a mug, trying to be charming and funny and light, saying something I meant to mean nothing and watching it land differently than I expected. Watching her face do the thing it did, watching 3 words travel from her throat into the air between us and change the temperature of everything. I did not know that day I was opening more than one door. The ceramic figure is on our windowsill now, the one in the home we share. It has its own small terrarium, a larger one with the trailing plant I brought that first evening, and several others she's added over the years, and there's more space in it now. Which she says is intentional. She said she designed it with room for things to grow, and I told her that was the best structural philosophy I'd ever heard, and she laughed in the way she laughs when she thinks something is genuinely funny and doesn't feel the need to hide it. The figure still has its knees drawn up. I asked her once whether she was going to make a new one that was standing. She thought about it. No, she said, I like her where she is. She's not giving up, she's just taking her time. I put my hand over hers. That's a good way to do it, I said. If I could go back to that kitchen and talk to the version of me standing there with the empty coffee mug and the practiced grin, I'm not sure what I'd say. Maybe nothing. Maybe it needed to happen exactly the way it happened, carelessly, lightly, like a joke, like nothing was at stake. Like I wasn't someone who had spent years understanding load-bearing structures and had still not understood what it meant to let someone bear some of the weight I was carrying. Maybe the joke was the only door available to someone who didn't yet know how to knock. What I know now is that real things often begin as accidents. Or what look like accidents from outside, from the angle that can't see all the variables. The truth is that Diane had thought about me in ways she hadn't told me. The truth is that I had thought about her in ways I hadn't admitted to myself. The truth is that Priya had seen a structure in the making and created the conditions for the load to be applied. And the truth is that a blush and 3 quiet words were not a small thing dressed up as a small thing. They were an honest answer to a question that deserved one. I did not come because I had nowhere else to stay. I came because some part of me, the part that calculates distances without meaning to, already knew this was the only place I wanted to be. She blushed, she said, if you want, and everything that followed was the answer to a question I hadn't known I was asking. That's the whole story. Or the part of it that belongs to the beginning, which is to say, the part that contains everything that matters. I think about the people watching this who have maybe said something small and throwaway and watched it land on someone's face in a way that changed the temperature of the room. I think about the people who have blushed and looked away and said something quiet and meant it completely. I think about the people who are staying in borrowed spaces, borrowed apartments, borrowed versions of their lives, waiting for the ground under them to feel solid enough to build on again. You don't always get to plan the moment that changes things. Sometimes the door you open is the one you were joking about. Sometimes the answer you receive is the one that reorganizes everything that came before it into a shape that finally makes sense. And sometimes the person you've been circling without admitting it is the person who made coffee before they knew you were awake, because some part of them already knew. Have you ever said something carelessly and realized mid-sentence that you actually meant it completely? Have you ever received an answer so honest it made your own question feel more serious than you'd intended? And if someone you'd been quietly noticing for a long time suddenly made space for you in their life, would you be brave enough to recognize it for what it was? Or would you call it coincidence and look away? If this story stayed with you the way it still stays with me, I'd love to know what part of it felt closest to something real in your own life. Leave a comment below. And if you want more stories told this way, from the honest middle of things, slowly, without shortcuts, please subscribe and leave a like. It's the quiet version of making coffee before someone's awake, and it means more than it looks.